线了，就跟我们大家一起。
Hi, Wenling. Should I go ahead?
We will have a 10 minutes opening officially for the conference. So the talk will start at 2:10.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll cue you. 好，那个工作人员可以把那个投影片撤下来。好，各位朋友，大家好。那我是台湾 STS 学会理事长洪文玲。今年非常特别的，在线上欢迎大家来参加我们第13届的台湾科技与社会研究学会年会。那大家也知道，今年我们原来的规划是希望大家都到东部去，能够在东华一起，能够迎向太阳哦。大家如果有看注意到我们这次的海报，那非常的热烈、热情，而且充满了力量。那这次的研讨会呢，当时规划在东部举行，我们有很多的想法。那当然，首先的是让大家能够一起到东部，用身体还有我们心智的感知。来认识或者体会花莲、台东或是宜兰东岸的这个田野，以 STS 的方式跟视野。那原本我们在年会开始之前呢，也规划了2天的花莲、台东的 STS 田野。那这个其实是我们很重要的工作。那在花莲的在地筹备伙伴们也都进行了很多实际上的规划。那虽然疫情的关系，我们就先保留这些规划，希望明年真的可以跟大家一起到花莲、台东去啊。那这次我们的研讨会的主题是回到原点，另类知识与科技研究的对话。那这个对台湾的 STS 来讲，觉得会是一个很重要的重新再开始。特别是我们等一下会听到的主题演讲，就是Emma Kowal， 他也是新的 CS 的理事长。那他会从澳洲那边的经验，特别是关于原住民健康，还有利用基因科学，或者是现在更进一步的表观遗传学这样子的方式来谈。那我们非常高兴能够邀请到他哦，当然邀请他是在他参加 CS 理事长的选举之前。那我觉得一切都是很棒的缘分，也希望未来就是能够真的旅行的时候，他可以自己来到台湾。那为了这次的年会，我相信线上的大家可能都已经参加过很多的场次。那特别要谢谢大家在这个繁忙的暑假哦，大家非常期待的暑假里面，愿意把我们的8月能够奉献给我们的 STS 议题哦。从8月6号我们的开场热身赛开始哦，就每一场次都有50-60个、60-70个人以上来参加，非常非常的热烈。那也给我们了一种运用不同科技物来讨论 STS， 来交流这样子的经验跟视野。其实任何情境，我想我们大家都是要朝向东方哦，就是向太阳前进，就像这次的年会的海报一样。那首先我要再次的感谢我们的年会筹备团队哦。那我等一下分享到的朋友，你可以开一下镜头，让我们大家看一下。那当然，首先就是学会的秘书长王志平。 那大家知道他是非常忠诚的工具人，就是让我们在各种平台上可以做一些新的尝试。然后今年新的尝试就是我们把这些活动都直播在学会的 YouTube 频道上。好，那再来是学会助理陈嘉德。志平的那个镜头留着啊。好，然后学会助理陈嘉德，他非常的稳定，然后可以适应我们这种非常庞杂的事务环境。还有我们年会的在地筹备伙伴，东华大学族群关系文化学系现在是系主任李一泽，还有东华大学环境学院戴兴盛，然后台东大学郑兆琪，东华大学黄英豪，然后东华大学博士生潘显阳跟陈庆元，那这些都是帮助我们在地筹备的重要伙伴。那接下来呢，我们这届的理监事呢，在一路上也给了就是给这整个会非常重要的协助跟支持，还有重要的意见盘点。陈嘉欣、洪广记、蔡友月、陈恒安、林宗德、陈正宏、欧彦中、赵恩杰、邱花妹、许宏斌、赵家伟、刘湘瑶、周宗燕。那他们有的是帮忙了我们的论文奖的审查，那有的是筹组了很多的场次，然后主持，还有赵恩杰负责我们的 STS， 还有李一哲负责我们的 STS 韩多路，还有有月也参加了就是 Emma 的导读，等一下也要回应哦。那非常非常多的伙伴哦，那我觉得这非常非常重要。那在这里呢，我就先说我的任期，这个是应该是到明年的时候要改选，所以呢，一方面谢谢我们的理监事伙伴还有朋友们一起来参与学会的运作，另外一方面呢，我也要鼓励哦，而且要真的要吸引我们更多的朋友，特别是年轻朋友来参与学术行政，这是非常非常有意义的工作。好，那个工作人员可以帮我们截个图吗？如果你可以看到很多人在上面的话，
可以，老师稍等哦。
好
，1、2、3，好，
谢谢。那今天的会议呢，就是在经费上，大家知道非常重要。除了我们稳定友善的盟友科技部之外呢，还有就是在地筹备单位东华大学原住民民族学院、环境学院。那还很特别的是，这次的活动得到花莲县政府原住民行政处、花莲县原住民族部落大学非常大力的补助。那所以我们的很多关于原住民族，特别是原住民族议题的论坛，还有论文场次，还有这次的公开演讲，那我们希望尽可能的公开在网络上，因为这是非常特别的一个讨论哦，那能够让更多的人来理解，而且来理解、来探讨这些议题。好，那这次的线上研讨会真的是非常非常有趣。我到现在目前呢，我们的会议场次呢，已经输入了320几位朋友的 email。那也就是说，这300多位朋友在星期一开始的论文场次里面，可以直接的进入我们会议室。那我要提醒大家哦，就是提供给学会的 email 呢，是你进入论文发表会议室的重要资讯哦，请大家就是以提供给学会的 email 进去，这样子就是才能维持一个研讨会讨论的品质跟意涵。好，那除了我们这种 housekeeping 的工作之外呢，我要再次的欢迎，也谢谢大家。在这么特殊的时候，我们用这么特殊的方式，然后来迎接这次的第13届 STS 年会。好，So Emma, I'm going to introduce you. So maybe you can try to share your slides. 好，那接下
Yes,
来我要
absolutely.
嗨
Okay.
Okay, so I'd like to introduce to you Professor Emma Kowal. Professor Emma Kowal is a medical and cultural anthropologist, and she's now the Deputy Director of the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University, Australia. She has done many services to the global STS community, such as being the convener of the Asian Pacific STS Network, co-chairing the 2018 Pacific 4S Conference at Sydney, and co-founding the Trans-Asia STS. So I first met Professor Kowal at an APSTSN conference in Singapore in 2013. She was a convener of the network at that time. I'm full of admiration for her at first sight. She's enthusiastic, optimistic, caring, and calm. It was just announced 2 days ago, Professor Kowal is the new president-elect of this major international STS society, 4S, Society for Social Study of Science. She will become the president this coming October. Professor Kowal has experience working as a medical doctor and public health researcher in Indigenous health setting. Her interests focus on the intersection of STS and Indigenous studies, particularly about Indigenous DNA in Australia. Over the years, she has authored over 100 publications, including monograph Trapped in the Gap, Doing Good in Indigenous Australia, published in 2015. Medical Anthropology Quarter's review said, quote, "It is a must-read for students in the social science of Australian Indigenous health and Indigenous health around the globe. Further, I recommend the book to anyone interested in social and cultural conceptualization of identities, the politics of health and illness, and inequity in relationships between those in power and those who are marginalized," unquote. Her work will bring us inspiration about our conference theme this year, Re-Indigenizing STS, dialogue between alternative knowledge and science technology studies, and insights into the never-ending searching about identity, sovereignty, equity, and well-being in Taiwan's dynamic society. Professor Emma Kowal is a researcher with profound reflection, an academic leader, and a community builder. As the chair of Taiwan STS Association, I'm delighted and excited to introduce Professor Emma Kowal and her talk about the meeting of Indigenous and scientific knowledges in epigenetic science. Professor Kowal, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Wenling. That was such a beautiful introduction. I'm close to tears now. That was so kind. And it is such an honor to be presenting to this conference. So I have turned on the captions. I hope that's useful. If it's distracting for anyone, then maybe vote in the chat and I can turn them off, but we thought this might be helpful. So one of my roles has been as founder of the Science and Society Network at Deakin University. Sorry, I'm just seeing how to. And today I will be, as Wenling mentioned, talking about the meeting of Indigenous and scientific knowledges in epigenetic science. So I will start with an acknowledgement of country, which is something that we do now very routinely in Australia, and it's something that over the past few decades has become more and more common. So this text is from our Pro Vice Chancellor for Indigenous Strategy and Innovation at Deakin University, Professor Mark Rose. As we gather for this meeting, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognise the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. We acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging, of all the lands we work and live on, and their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. And so for me, I'm speaking to you from Melbourne in Australia, which is Wurundjeri land of the Kowal Nation. So Wenling did such a good job introducing me. I can do this very briefly. So as she mentioned, I have a background in medicine, and I am a cultural and medical anthropologist of the intersection of science and indigeneity. And alongside my research into the implications of genetics and now epigenetics for Indigenous people, I've also been a founding deputy director at the National Centre for Indigenous Genomics at the Australian National University. And I'll mention that very briefly a bit later. And I've also been involved in the summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genomics, which is that international consortium that started in the US 10 years ago, and we've just a couple of years ago have an Australian chapter, and that aims to build the next generation of Indigenous leaders in genomics and genomic science and genomic ethics. And Wenling mentioned, I'm involved with the Science and Society Network, the Trans-Asia STS Network, and please, if you're interested, there's the Google Groups addressed, or you can find the Google Groups and sign up. We've also got the Australasian STS Grad Network, which is a network of STS PhD students and early career researchers across Australia and New Zealand, but pretty good time zone, so there may be events there that are of interest to any of you. And yes, I'm going to take over in a couple of months as president of FORES. So my talk today will be first giving you some information on Indigenous people in Australia, and hopefully that can be a good basis for some discussion, comparative discussion afterwards, because I know there's a lot of people interested in and who do research in Indigenous people in Taiwan. I will talk about genetics and Indigenous people, and then epigenetics. Drawing on a current project I'm undertaking with colleagues on the reception of epigenetics among Indigenous people in Australia and more broadly. And I have to have a warning that I am discussing in the slides some the history of race science, and it is very a distressing history, and some people may find that distressing. Okay. So this is an image of all of the language groups in Australia. And I just have to say, I can't see the chat in this particular screen. So just let me know, Wenling, if there's anything I need to know. So this is an image of all the language groups in Australia. So if you're used to seeing a map of Australia, you might be used to the state boundaries. We have 8 states and territories, but this is a very different map of all of the Indigenous language groups and the traditional boundaries. And so we can see here just the sheer diversity, over 250 language groups. And these are groups that all exist today in some form. Pre-1788, which is when we had the British invasion and colonisation of Australia, there were perhaps 750,000 Indigenous people. As you can imagine, there's many different estimates of that, but there were definitely over 250 language groups, and people were predominantly hunter-gatherers and hunter-gatherer fishers, and that form of economics is also a cosmology. So it involves kinship not only with all of the people in your language group, but also the land, all of the non-humans. Everything is in a coherent, integrated whole, and life is as much about your relationship with your ancestors and relationships with the non-humans in your environment. So all of these language groups were severely impacted by British invasion, moving from Sydney in the southeast across the country. Initially, smallpox caused huge amounts of death. Potentially 90% of the population was impacted by smallpox. Also other diseases and frontier violence. So there were many massacres all over the country across the 19th century. By 1930, there were only about 50,000 Indigenous people in Australia because of these factors, the disease and violence. But this was taken to prove what was called the doomed race theory, which was part of 19th century and carrying into 20th century race science that saw Indigenous people as an inferior race, so that they would naturally die out when they come in contact with Europeans, presumably a superior race. But soon around this time, it became clear that the numbers of Indigenous people were starting to increase, and particularly people of mixed race, so Indigenous people of mixed Indigenous and European ancestry, or Indigenous and Asian ancestry, and that the population was increasing. And so then we had the policies of firstly absorption and then assimilation, which sought to absorb Indigenous people into the wider non-Indigenous population through various means. Particularly of historical note was the removal of children from their families. So many thousands of mostly children of mixed race were removed from their families and put in institutions, when many experienced abuse. And this is now known as the stolen generations. So things started to really change in the 1960s with Indigenous activism taking hold. So we had in 1967 a referendum to change the constitution, which was fairly boring, to include Indigenous people in the census and to allow the Commonwealth government, the federal government, to make laws for Indigenous people. But symbolically, it was a really important moment when over 90% of the Australian population voted for Indigenous rights. And really since then, we have had slow progress. The land rights movement, particularly in the 1990s, we had a really important court case, the Mabo case, which led to land rights across the country of a limited form. And we have had a reconciliation movement in the 1990s, and more recently, the recognition of the stolen generations and an apology from the Prime Minister in 2008. So where we are now is a population of around 860,000 people, which is about 3% of the whole population of Australia. And I believe that is quite a similar proportion to the Taiwan Indigenous people. Around 20% of those people live in remote communities, so communities where they live far. They're just what we call discrete communities, where most people, or nearly everyone, is Indigenous, and from a single or a limited number of language groups. The rest of the 80% live in cities or large regional centres, and around 11% speak their own languages at home. There's only about a dozen of those 250 languages that are still thriving. Most are endangered or have actually become extinct. So the Indigenous population today suffers from many inequalities. Health inequalities are very significant, and that leads to a life expectancy 8 to 9 years less than non-Indigenous people. And that is mostly due to high rates of chronic disease, injury, mental illness and suicide. There are high rates of harmful, what we call harmful behaviours within the public health speak, smoking, obesity, harmful alcohol and drug use. And there's also poorer social determinants of health, so lower rates of education, of employment, lower income and poorer housing. So all of that, unfortunately, still is part of life for Indigenous people. But I thought I'd just mention that communities have protected themselves really well from COVID-19, although just in the last week, there has been some communities in Western New South Wales where we have seen the virus enter. But until then, the communities have done an incredible job keeping themselves safe. And just a little more on the background of Indigenous people, because of course I want to give you a very good picture. So politically, we do have more and more Indigenous parliamentarians, so in state and federal parliaments, but we don't have quotas for Indigenous representatives as there are in some countries, and we don't have an Indigenous political party. There've been many experiments in Indigenous administration over the years. Some notable ones were the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which was a large national service delivery agency run by Indigenous people that was around for about 15 years. And then following the breakdown of that commission, there was what's called the Northern Territory Emergency Response, or also called the Intervention, that started in 2007, which was a very large injection of funds, but also control over Indigenous people. And that was ostensibly in response to a report by an Indigenous senior woman about child sexual abuse across different communities in the Northern Territory. So there's been crises, frequent crises in Indigenous communities. So land councils have been a really important political structure. The native title, the Indigenous land rights have led to what we call native title representative bodies around the country to put forward land claims. And we also have an extensive but not perfect system of protecting Indigenous heritage sacred sites in particular. Then we have a lot of community controlled services, from local councils to health and legal services, and also family reconnection services. So I mentioned the stolen generations. So there are organisations that can help Indigenous people to try and find family members that they have been separated from because of the stolen generations. And in Victoria, where I am, in the southeast corner of Australia, we are further along, most advanced in supporting Indigenous political structures. So we do have a First Peoples Assembly, which just started a couple of years ago, which has representatives from Indigenous communities from across Victoria. There's also a lot of work towards an Indigenous voice to Parliament, a national assembly of some kind. There's been a lot of move towards constitutional change to recognise Indigenous people in a preamble of the Constitution, and a lot of activism to try and develop treaties with Indigenous people in different states. And in Victoria, we have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that is in development. So all of that is background so that you know about Indigenous people in Australia. So now I'm going to talk about research on Indigenous people, which is the context for both genetic and epigenetic research that I have been studying over the last decade or so. So the research on Indigenous people began really almost as soon as the British colonised. Of course, there were reports from sailors and explorers even prior to British colonisation, But after 1788, within a very few years, skulls of Indigenous people began to be sent to Europe for study. And these would have been stolen from grave sites or from Indigenous people that were killed in frontier violence or in the criminal justice system. So on the left, you see a very kind of typical image from the 19th century where the scientific belief, scientific evidence of the time was that there was a hierarchy of races, that the classical Greek form was the highest, the most superior race, and that other races, in this case of this image, Africans, were lower and were on a scale closer to chimpanzees than they were to the Greeks or the descendants of the Greeks, which were the Europeans. And of course, this is false and extremely racist, and importantly, the basis of the scientific basis and justification for colonization, for slavery, and for much else. This image at the top is from the around the 1930s. So in the 20th century, ideas of race began to be problematized, and it was realized that things were a lot more complex. This image is Norman Tyndale, who's a very important Australian anthropologist, who went out from Adelaide, the city of Adelaide, to dozens, even hundreds of Aboriginal communities over decades to take measurements. Here he is doing a head measurement. But this was also an important phase of research, and a lot of Aboriginal people remember these research projects happening where a whole lot of scientists would come and take a lot of measurements. And this was, again, to understand Aboriginal people as biological subjects and how they fit into the wider human family. So it wasn't really until the late 60s, so I believe this is maybe the first study that was not looking at Aboriginal people as biological subjects, but as patients, as individual bodies, as humans that had illnesses that needed to be addressed because of issues of welfare and humanitarianism. So this was the same year as the referendum that I discussed, and it was a survey of children in Queensland missions. So these are Aboriginal settlements run by the government and or churches where children were supposed to be cared for, and they found that they had very, very high mortality rates and very poor health. So this was the start of research that was trying to improve the health of Indigenous people. And many decades later, we have now research that is entirely directed by Indigenous people, and this is one important institute this year, the Lowacha Institute, named after Lowacha O'Donoghue, who is one of the first Aboriginal nurses and a very senior woman in Indigenous health research. So this is run by Indigenous people and direct funding to ensure that the Indigenous health research is conducted in line with what Indigenous people want to see. And an important kind of step along the way, this is actually a report back in 2000, so more than 20 years ago, from colleagues, actually my PhD supervisor, Professor Ian Anderson, in Melbourne. And the message is, we don't like research, that's the Indigenous people don't like research, but in Koori hands, Koori is the word for an Indigenous person from Victoria, it could make a difference. And that's really been the attitude of Indigenous people towards research for the last few decades, that it has done a lot of harm, but it can be used to help the community if it's done properly. So I'll now just move to talking briefly about genetics. So genetic research has generally not been done properly, if we're talking about research. So here's a few images from the Indigenous genetic research world. So genetics has often been associated with what is called biopiracy, so the exploitation or stealing of biological, in this case, genetic material from Indigenous groups for commercial gain. And on the right-hand side, there's an image from the Indigenous Peoples Council on Biocolonialism, which is an international organization based in the United States that was started in 1999 in response to the Human Genome Diversity Project, which was a project that was alongside the Human Genome Project, the project that sequenced the first human genome, but it sought to find a genetic diversity amongst Indigenous peoples around the world. And very soon this was labelled the Vampire Project by Indigenous groups, led by Native American activists and scholars and scientists, but spreading all around the world. And it was a really important moment for Indigenous people to critique genetic research and to see their genetic material as their property. So since the Indigenous Peoples Council on Biocolonialism was formed, there have indeed been quite a few instances where genetic research on Indigenous people has been seen as negative. So one example from our part of the world was in 2006. There was researchers who were doing research on the gene for an enzyme, MAO2, and it was a gene which can also be associated with particular risky behaviours. And so colloquially, the gene is called the warrior gene by some scientists and in the popular press. So even though the research had nothing to do with behaviours, it was actually due to looking at treatment for nicotine addiction. It was widely seen as the warrior gene and seen as an explanation for inherent violence amongst Maori people. This second example was the Havasupai people who live in the base of the Grand Canyon, and they had DNA taken for research in the 1990s for diabetes research, but this was then used very widely for other research by the researchers without permission from Indigenous people. And they spent many years in a court case to get their samples back, and they did actually get them back in 2010. And the third example is of the Yanomami people in Brazil, who also had samples taken, this time in the 1960s, for genetic research, and they succeeded after many years to have them returned in 2015. So all of these are examples where genetic research has been harmful. Indigenous people have experienced it as exploitative and reinforcing negative stereotypes that have real world effects on their communities. Now, before I finish talking about genetics, I just want to mention the National Centre for Indigenous Genomics, and I won't talk about this here. I've written a lot about it, but this is a project I've been involved with since 2010, and it was started because of a collection of samples that was very similar to the samples taken from the Yanomami, in that it was around the same time, the 60s and 70s. It was for similar reasons, to understand the genetic variation of those people. But those samples, rather than ending up being returned, they actually formed the first Indigenous governed genome facility in the world. And that came about from very close engagement with Indigenous leaders and scholars from around the world to advise the university on how they should manage this collection of blood samples. So I won't say more about that, but just to say that things have changed in terms of genetic research, but it has been a long road. So I now, in the last part of the talk, want to talk about epigenetics. So it's been very much a different story in how epigenetics has been received and experienced by Indigenous peoples as opposed to genetics. And I just want to acknowledge this is research that's ongoing. So I'm just giving you some of our results from the ongoing research, funded by the Australian Research Council, and my collaborators on this project, Megan Warren from the University of Adelaide, Maurizio Maloney from Deakin University, our postdoc, Jaya Keeney, our PhD student, Henrietta Byrne, and also Dr. Yoko Asakawa, who is doing some research internships with us. So firstly, just for those who are not familiar with epigenetics, so epigenetics is to do with the expression of genes. So we're all familiar with DNA. So we have chromosomes, which are very tightly wound DNA. And that is the same in every cell in our body. Our DNA is more or less, with some very brief, very small exceptions, the same in every cell in our body. But the different cells across our body do very different things. Our eye cells and our skin cells are completely different. And that is because different genes are expressed in different cells. So this is epigenetics is the mechanisms by which some genes are turned on and some genes are turned off in different parts of our body. And DNA methylation has been the most studied kind of epigenetic mechanism that turns genes off. So as I said, it's necessary for the body to function. So the body would be a complete mess, a lump of cells, if it wasn't for epigenetics to turn particular genes on and off. But these genes turning on and off can also happen in response to the environment. And the word environment is used there in a very scientific term to mean everything that we are exposed to. So food, stress, toxins in the environment, smoking, all of those things can influence the expression of genes. So these are seen as important biological switches in development. So there's the idea is that in early childhood, particularly, the environment, and in also antenatally, when the child is in the womb, the environment can have epigenetic effects that might affect the child through its whole life. And there's also, we know that it does affect people across generations. So initially, we can think of a child in utero who is exposed to stress, and then that will affect that child after they are born and through their life course. We also know that it can have effects across 2 generations. So if the fetus is a girl biologically, and she has eggs that are in the womb of her mother, those eggs, once she is born, will then lead to the second generation, the grandchildren of the original mother. And epigenetic changes can affect those grandchildren. There's also a lot of evidence not for humans, mostly in worms, model organisms, that epigenetic effects can have effects for many generations, for dozens even of generations, but we don't have that evidence in humans as yet. So that's a bit of a background on what epigenetics is. So I talked about how genetics has a long history and is very much seen as a continuation of race science, of trying to say which races are superior or inferior and what are the biological aspects which define Aboriginal people. Epigenetics has been received very differently. So these are just a few headlines about epigenetics, and these are all reporting or written by Indigenous people, mostly in the US and in Canada. And it's seen as a way to explain why intergenerational trauma affects Indigenous people particularly. Sorry, and so this is a really good example it's from a Canadian First Nations organisation, the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation Mental Wellness Forum, and they argue that genetics and particularly epigenetics is a way of understanding, in this case, Anishinaabe creation stories. So they reference the stringing together of the seeds of life and as part of the creation story. And the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation interprets this as a form of genetic code, that the outcome of stringing together is to protect children and support their growth. And we can see this here represented in a cradle board, which traditionally is a place for children to grow and thrive. And in the explanation of what they mean by this metaphor, it is very explicitly about not genetics, but epigenetics. So they cite Amy Bombay, who is a really important Native American scientist who does study epigenetics, one of the very few. And she says, we now know that experiences and the environment can turn on or off genes, so the function of those genes is changed. In terms of how that is transmitted generationally, we know that if those changes happen to be in the germline, so in the egg or the sperm, they have the potential to be transmitted across generations. So this is drawing on the science, maybe extending what is well established, but really clearly speaking to an Indigenous idea of transmission and of inheritance. And I'll just be a little bit quicker here because I know that we are starting to run short on time, and I do want to hear all your questions and comments. This is just another example from Tony Tenfigur's, a Lakota elder, which is speaking to not so much child development, but transgenerational trauma. And in referencing ancestral memory and DNA, he's there talking about epigenetics and the inheritance of acquired changes. Maybe I'll just skip over this, but this is yet another example of a Native American company, an artist who offer virtual reality experiences for urban Indigenous people seeking to connect with country. And they talk about blood memory, which is formed by epigenetic mechanisms, and Indigenous people who have been disconnected from their history can use, they argue, their tools of virtual reality to reconnect with their blood memory. So I know the examples I've given often are from the US and Canada, because there are a lot of rich examples, but epigenetics has also been starting to be used and referenced and drawn on by Indigenous people in Australia. So this is the first 1,000 days, which is it's an international movement that tries to focus on the time antenatal period and the first 2 years after birth as the most important time for child development. And the first 1,000 days Australian chapter is specifically looking at Indigenous people. So it's quite interesting that the first 1,000 days Australian chapter, which is part of the developmental origins of health and disease, the DOHAD subdiscipline of science, that specifically has focused on Indigenous people, and it has been founded by an Indigenous researcher. And then on the other side, so not looking at development and epigenetics, but intergenerational trauma. There's another important organisation called the Healing Foundation, which is run by Indigenous practitioners and scholars who offer a whole lot of support and services for Indigenous people who have been affected by the stolen generation. And they are drawing on epigenetics in some of their projects to understand how intergenerational trauma occurs and how it might be assisted. So we're seeing, I think, a very different response of Indigenous people to epigenetics as opposed to genetics. And so why is that? So in just the last couple of minutes before I stop, I want to just give you some indications and some of the initial results from our research into this question. So as I've kind of alluded to, epigenetics gives a biological basis to the experiences of historical trauma. So historical trauma is a really important way for Indigenous people to understand the health inequalities that they face and the transgenerational issues that many families are facing with poor education, with issues around drug and alcohol abuse, and cycles of engagement with the criminal justice system. So epigenetics is seen as something that, by some Indigenous people, as something that can help them to understand why this occurs. So we've seen Mark Wenatong, who's a very senior Indigenous doctor and researcher, who talks about epigenetics to agency and sees epigenetics as an important tool to understand the poor state of Indigenous health. Another really important Indigenous doctor, Sandra Eads, she has spoken about using epigenetics, microbiomics, telomeres, and other concepts that provide a cyclical view of health across generations. And science is catching up with that spiritual view of health. So a lot of these Indigenous people see in epigenetics concepts that are resonant with Indigenous worldviews. And as I've mentioned, the scholar there is Professor Kerry Arabina, who has started the Australian chapter of the first 1,000 days. So we've done about 30 interviews with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who are engaged in epigenetics in different ways from different fields. And people seem to think that these knowledge systems are compatible. So not all of Western science, but specifically epigenetics and the developmental origins of health and disease are areas that seem to resonate with some people. So these quotes here, DOHAD and epigenetics is something that we have known for a long time. We just didn't have that name for it. Words like these, epigenetics, are just a different way of naming the stories that Aboriginal people passed on to each other. I definitely think the idea of health being transmitted across generations is more consistent with Indigenous knowledge systems. It's just not called epigenetics, so meaning Indigenous people don't call this epigenetics. So there was a strong sense of that it was congruent, it was compatible with Indigenous knowledge systems in a way that genetics was not. So there was also concern that epigenetics might be deterministic, and we see across many of the much commentary on epigenetics this tension between epigenetics as reversible, as allowing changes in the body to be wound back, and epigenetics as potentially deterministic as genetics. So another Indigenous leader, Justin Muhammad, who was chair at the time of the peak body for Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations. So he spoke a lot about epigenetics, and he says it's very scary to think that an individual event or a multitude of events or the environment that you were raised in can actually switch off your potential of what you could be. On the other side of the thing, I think it's very encouraging to think that there might be just some minor adjustments which can actually switch on so you can actually reach your potential. So there is this tension between epigenetics as deterministic and as reversible. So that leads us to just the last point I'll make, just to summarize the potential risks of epigenetics. So it's certainly been very exciting for scientists who are interested in epigenetics that there has been a really positive reception. But there's also, a number of risks. And I've written about epigenetic hype, and others have also written about that. And we see this in comments that are made by Indigenous people, particularly in the US, using epigenetics, for example, to explain the Trail of Tears, so historical events from the 19th century. And we have no evidence in humans that epigenetic changes can be transmitted more than 2 generations. So if a lot of the Indigenous embrace of epigenetics really depends on epigenetic changes being transmitted for many more generations than we actually have evidence for. There is, as I've kind of mentioned with Justin Muhammad's comments, a risk of constructing Indigenous Australians as biologically inferior or damaged by their epigenetic exposures. And this idea of plasticity, which is another way of thinking about epigenetic changes, we tend to think that soft inheritance, so not genetics, but acquired characteristics that can be inherited, as being more progressive. And that, I think Indigenous people are definitely responding to that, those associations. But there is historically, and we can see in the way that epigenetics might be playing out in some countries in terms of policy, that there is a risk of the equal determinism to genetics, and a risk of increasing blame. For example, blaming mothers for exposures that their children have had in the womb. So I will leave it there and give us some time to discuss this. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Kowal, for the inspiring talk. And this truly comes from the situation and about Australia. They come towards the Genome Project in the history, and the newer hopeful explanation that people are searching from epigenetic. And the reminder at the end is certainly really valuable for all of us to think of. So here I want to introduce the responder from Taiwan STS, Professor Cai Youyuan. So Professor Cai is an associate research fellow in the Institute of Sociology, Academia Sinica. She's also a Fulbright scholar. Her research focus includes medical and cultural sociology, race, ethnicity, Aboriginal health and identity in Taiwan. She has authored the book, Mental Disorder of the Tao Aboriginal Minority in Taiwan, Modernity, Social Change, and the Origin of Social Suffering, and lead the research project Imagined Genetic Community, Human Genome Biobank, Human Classification, and Scientific Health Governance in the Context of International Comparison. So I think she's the perfect respondent for you. So please, Professor Tsai.
Okay. Thanks, Wenling. Also, thanks for Professor Anna Kowal. Wonderful presentation. So nice to meet you online. I'm Yue Tsai from Institute of Sociology at Academia Sinica. Actually, being a cultural anthropologist and a medical doctor, Emma's research is just like her interdisciplinary training, showing STS approach to dialogue between biomedicine and humanity and the social side. Emma has been published over 80 articles and a famous book, Trapped in a Gap, Doing Good in Indigenous Australia, and co-authored 2 books. So it is my honor to be Emma's panelist on Taiwan STS Keynote speech. However, it is difficult for me to give comment to a very productive scholar like Emma. So my comments and feedback are based on Emma's some article and her presentation today. Let's start with a new trend. After the Human Genome Project completed in 2003, there has been a new trend of the affinity between genetic research and identity politics. Facing the new trend, many STS scholars argue that we need to develop a new theoretical approach like biosocial cooptation. As far as I'm concerned, the new trend also points out an important debate, whether we can use the concept of race or ethnicity for genetic research or not, such as epigenetic or ancestry DNA testing. So my first question is, what is your standpoint on the concept of race or ethnicity into epigenetic research of indigenous people? I think this debate is also related to the question of epidemiological status of race or ethnicity for STS. Several years ago, our first president, Professor John Fujimura, came to Taiwan STS keynote speech. I remember someone asked the same question to her. John's answer is that she objects to use the concept of race or ethnicity in genetic research. So what is your theoretical standpoint on the issue for indigenous people? I'm just wondering if the environmental epigenetics of indigenous people is still typical of race-based research. My second question is, do you agree or disagree we can adapt environmental epigenetics as a kind of projected biological essentialism to resolve the problem of health inequality for indigenous people? Like the post-colonial scholar Spivak used the concept of projected essentialism. It is sometimes advantageous for minorities, such as indigenous people, to temporarily essentialize themselves and to bring forward their group identity in a simplified way to achieve certain goal. So I'm curious if the development of environmental epigenetic and strategic biological essentialism can resolve the problem of health inequality for Indigenous people in Australia. For you, in condition of epigenetic optimism or epigenetic hype among indigenous people, what is the contribution of STS? My third question is, compare with the field of genetics for indigenous people worldwide. You also mentioned the embrace of epigenetic is remarkable in Australia. It seems to me indigenous academic and the indigenous health organization and the indigenous medical doctor attempt to support environmental epigenetic in Australia. For your opinion, will the development of environmental epigenetic lead to a new kind of biomedical intervention or epigenetic-based health policy emerge in Australia? And what is the role of the indigenous elite in indigenous health discourse? Can you share more your experience more in Australia? My fourth question is related to the relationship between white researchers and the indigenous people. This part you have made an important contribution in your book, Trapped in the Gap. As a white female professional and a medical doctor, I'm just wondering how you can overcome the stereotype or stigma of white doctor or white researcher into indigenous community. Becoming a white anti-racist from your turn, how do you tackle the ethical and moral responsibility for your indigenous research? In Taiwan, because of colonial history of biomedicine, there is a tension between biomedical scientists and the indigenous people. Can you explain your experience and reflection into Taiwan audience? Moreover, in your article, Anthropology, Indigeneity and Epigenetic, you mention anthropologies of benevolent form, and in your book, Trapped in the Gap, in conclusion, you argue like force of benevolence. Your sentence look like poetry. You mention like tell a story like both acknowledge imperial power and leave room for possibility to encourage critical purchase without cutting off the string of hope. I'm just wondering what you mean anthropologies of benevolent form or force of benevolence. For you, the notion of benevolence is related to researcher moral responsibility or a good institutional arrangement. Can you explain it more? My last question is related to Taiwan indigenous DNA and our national identity. From my point of view, Taiwan case is far away from the development of epigenetic in Australia. However, facing the scientific authority of genetic in identity claim, Taiwan is an extremely unique case. Specifically, Taiwan indigenous DNA has played the key role to rewriting Taiwanese ancestry, origin, and the national history. Based on my research, scientists in Taiwan use Taiwan indigenous DNA in terms of mitochondrial DNA analysis to identify Taiwanese different from Chinese. However, scientists in China also use Taiwan indigenous DNA in terms of Y chromosome to identify Taiwanese is from China. Chinese and Taiwanese share the same root, and both of them publish their findings in international journals. For me, scientific research does not offer clear answers to complex issues related to racial, ethnic, or national identity. Using the different technology like Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA analysis, the existing national identity will lead to different scientific claims. So, facing the disputes of national identity based on Taiwan indigenous DNA, I'm just wondering if you can give in some suggestion and a reminder to us in terms of your excellent research. And how do you think about genetic evidence and identity politics? These are my questions for you. Thank you again for your wonderful presentation and excellent contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Youyue, for the wonderful questions. So there are many. So Emma, do you want to just respond to her question first? Maybe 10 to 15 minutes. We have the session until 40. Okay.
Okay, yeah, no, and you just let me know, Wenling, because yes, these are amazing, wonderful, rich questions that I could talk for literally hours. So I will start. Yeah, so the first question of race and ethnicity and how I position myself in terms of these concepts. And there is a lot of, there's been mountains of commentary to say that we should not use the word race, that race is biological and we shouldn't use it. And ethnicity is the cultural term. Oh, I should say, Wenling, should I turn the closed captions on? Is that, do you think, useful, or should not worry about it?
What?
Oh, I was just asking if I should turn on the closed captions. Yes? Okay, just, I can't hear you, but I will just turn them on.
Hear your voice.
Oh no, I know you're fine. So I just wondered for the audience if it's useful.
Yeah,
I know
you can turn it on. I'm just not sure if we can see it. The Meet technology is mysterious.
All right, that's fine. I thought yes, because I know my accent is not maybe not what you're used to. So yeah, these questions of whether to use the term race or use the term ethnicity are, they're so rich. And I suppose in a nutshell, I think that in Australia, we don't tend to use the term race. So I actually have a piece in the Journal of Anthropological Sciences called What is Race in Australia? So we tend not to use the term at all. We will talk about racism, but we don't tend to talk about race. So because that's the context I'm in, I suppose it's easy for me to say, well, let's not throw out the concept of race, because if we throw it out, then we lose the connection with the history of how this concept has come about. And I'm very engaged and wanting to engage with the history of my own discipline, the history of anthropology, including the parts which are really difficult and really distressing and really racist, because I think that the stakes of making knowledge about people who we see as different to us, those stakes are so high, and I think that retaining the use of the word race helps to remind us that we are making knowledge, biological knowledge about the people who are different to us, who are vulnerable, and that knowledge is very powerful. So that would be my first response. And then you mentioned strategic biological essentialism, which is a concept I developed in that paper in Science, Technology and Human Values, which needs to acknowledge Karis Thompson and her concept of strategic naturalization, which is another way to get at the tendency of people, of some groups of people, to want to see themselves as biologically distinct, and who want to have research on those biologically distinct aspects of themselves. So examples, and I'm thinking here of Alondra Nelson's work on reconciliation projects. So she, of course, writes a lot about African American people using genetic ancestry testing to connect with their supposed country of origin. Most of those tests are on mitochondrial DNA, so it's only one particular ancestor out of all of our ancestors, just the direct maternal line. But African American people, quite a lot of them find it really meaningful, and there is even a industry of so-called root tourism, where people will travel to countries that match their genetic tests to connect with their African history. So another example from a special issue I edited in Social Studies of Science in 2013 from Michael Kent about Indigenous people on Lake Titicaca who drew on genetic research to try and show that they were the Indigenous people of the area, and that other Indigenous people around did not have as much of a claim as they did to be the traditional owners and to control the cultural tourism in the area. So they're just some examples of what I would call strategic biological essentialism, where groups are drawing on biological group characteristics for their own purposes, to achieve particular aims. And the commentary, I think, and my view is that it's difficult, and I think that was the purpose of that piece in American Anthropologist with Megan Warren. That and this is the partly the answer to the anthropology of benevolence question that you had. So Indigenous people using science for their own purposes, as someone who has worked in Indigenous health and Indigenous research for many years, this seems to be exactly the aim all along, is for Indigenous people to be drawing on science for their own purposes and in their own control. So this is I would say a very benevolent situation, but in some ways, to reflect on the moral responsibility of the researcher, the moral responsibility is to always ask questions and always be concerned about the potential for race to be deterministic, to lead to to negative consequences, and to eventually or ultimately reinforce racism. So it's important to continue to ask these questions, even if rather than asking those questions of white scientists, we're asking those questions of Indigenous people. But it's a difficult position to be in, and in some ways you could summarize it with that old important phrase about using the master's tools. Can you use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house? And I think it's a Bell Hooks quote. And so our response might be, well, you know, you can't. And so if you're using the tools of genetics or even epigenetics to try and make arguments about race, about group biological difference that are emancipatory, maybe that's not possible. And that then relates to the strings of hope. So that quote is from Anna Tsing, her wonderful book, I think Friction. That's where she uses that phrase, that while you need your responsibility critically, intellectually, to keep on asking questions, even when it seems morally that things are aligning nicely, that Indigenous people, for example, are directing science and embracing it themselves. It's important to maintain your critical edge, but also important not to be, what's called the hermeneutics of suspicion in the Foucauldian scholarship, that you just are trying to, destroy any hope that might be there for using the master's tools to build a better world. So I want to always maintain space for those possibilities.
Yep.
There's more. I could say more. There's more questions I haven't done, but I thought I should give.
But that's exactly 10 minutes. Do you want to continue, or should we collect some questions? Okay, so we have we have some hands raised. I haven't seen any questions. Oh, Henry has a question. So Henry, do you want to speak the question yourself?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Emma, for your presentation. My curiosity falls upon the agenda of stigma. Actually, when it comes to indigenous health research, there are some stigma comes along and then I wonder that the shift from genetic to epigenetic determinism, whether or not this will essentially reduce the stigma that can lead to, for example, discriminative kind of health policy design. And then, well, actually, in some case, for example, like autism, the shift from genetic determinism to epigenetic, that is helpful for example, parents to reduce their load of care. But I don't know if what happens in indigenous health research. Can you tell us more about the social consequences of this shift then? Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. That's a great question, and it's really nice to meet you, having corresponded. So yeah, and this actually relates to one of the. Oh, so did you? No. This relates to one of Yo-Yo's questions that I didn't get to about health policy and about how this is being translated into changes in interventions. So, and I'll use that to answer your question. So we do have some interviews with people like from education and from social work, where epigenetics is being mobilized, particularly in training. So for example, social workers and youth workers working with disadvantaged Indigenous young people are being taught that, what you're seeing in, say, very difficult behaviors is because of epigenetics. That epigenetics explains how both the trauma that this young person has experienced in their life, but also the experience transgenerationally of their parents and grandparents, that explains their behavior. And we only have, a few interviews, so it's not with people in this category. It's not at all comprehensive or representative, but it does seem to help the caregivers, the professionals. It seems to help them just understand and not be less frustrated with their jobs. Now, whether or not this will lead to to stigmatization, to entrenchment of stereotypes, like you might expect of if it was a genetic explanation, I think it's very difficult. It's difficult to tell. I think that there is definitely a danger in that, because if you think about it, epigenetics, which might tell us, why this group of young people have very difficult behaviours, using drugs, have poor mental health, are aggressive or violent. It might help you to rationalize that, to kind of understand that in what you feel is a scientific way. But it's still, it's that tension that Justin Mohammed, the head of the Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, identified. If we can say, well, this is reversible, that's brilliant. But if we are saying, well, these young people are damaged epigenetically, and therefore there's nothing we can do for them really, then that's also a big concern. And so even if it's helping health providers, if it's helping social workers or youth workers to feel a bit better about, to be able to do their job better, I would be concerned that would be a temporary effect, that there's the scientific, the epigenetic hype probably does have an impact to help to rationalize it, but I don't know if that's going to be very long lasting.
Thank you. So next question, we have it from Yichen.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Kowal. And my question is a little bit similar to Harry's, right? Yeah. And I'm a medical doctor, and I'm also complete my PhD study in Indigenous people's drinking. So my question is that we do have genetics studies on Indigenous people's drinking during the 1990s, I think, and there were no further discussion on them. And some Indigenous people may even accept the theory that they do have the gene which make their body more vulnerable to alcohol. But we all understand that we cannot simply say that high prevalence of drinking is because indigenous people have different bodies. And so I think the epigenetics may be a theoretical solution to the possibility of racism that is brought by genetic studies. But my question is that when we try to link the notion of historical trauma to certain health situations, particularly to mental health issues, with such a strategy, again, over-victimize the indigenous people or problematize the indigenous people's behavior or their decision. I mean, take my study, for example. I think drinking practices may have various meanings and which cannot be understood based on the health or medical narratives. So I think we can still see the agency and resilience or even resistance regarding indigenous people drinking. So yeah, so that is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant question. You can, and I look forward to, I'll have to look up your work. And it's always nice to have more MD PhDs, because it is an unusual combination. Yeah, so I agree with you that it's uncertain whether epigenetic explanations are going to be less deterministic and helpful. I haven't actually seen epigenetics of alcohol use, but I'm sure it exists if I look for it. But interestingly, you mentioned that there have been genetic studies done on Indigenous Taiwanese people in relation to drinking. People have spoken about wanting to do genetic studies of Indigenous people in Australia to, to say, find out why they drink so much. And no one has ever done that. So it's been consistently raised since the very, earliest, probably since the 1990s, when it first became possible to do those kinds of studies. But no one has ever done it. I think because of the stigma of genetic research, another kind of stigma, kind of reverse stigma. And actually, just the other day, I was giving a talk, and someone who did work on the genetics of liver cirrhosis was wanting to do their work in Indigenous communities, and I still don't think it's possible. So the fact that research has happened in Taiwan, but it hasn't happened in Australia, I think indicates a level of agency, of political power that Indigenous people in Australia might have that's more than Indigenous people in Taiwan. And I think that's, all of this, of course, is about political power. And groups with more political power have less problems with, drug and alcohol, or they're using them, but they're not, they're doing it privately and not coming to the attention of, of health providers or the criminal justice system. So, I think, and even there's a really important Indigenous scholar, Chelsea Bond, who I'm sure Ina probably knows of, who's recently said that trauma, the whole notion of trauma, is a colonial discourse, and we shouldn't be talking about historical trauma or any other kind of trauma, because it reduces the attention to the structures of colonialism. And as we know from Patrick Wolf, very important post-colonial scholar in Australia, that colonialism is a structure, not an event. It's not something that happened or just happens once. It's ongoing. So, I would want to engage with, with Professor Chelsea Bond to just, I don't necessarily agree with her that trauma cannot be used. It is part of the master's tools that cannot help. But yeah, these are, important and interesting discussions to continue having.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. So there are a lot more for us, in the Asia Pacific region to work together. So here we have another question from Anna. So you want to speak your question?
Hello. Hi, Emma. Finally, it's nice to meet you. Thank you for the talk. I think it's a very important topic in Taiwan right now, and some of your work mentions the tension, both explicit and implicit tension between scientific research and Indigenous communities. And then recently, about a decade ago, we started having the CRB, so Institutional Review Board, and with the establishment or the requirement of ethic review boards, there's been decrease in scientific research or health research involving Indigenous peoples. And so my question, and this sort of follows up with Ethan's question, right? As a person that's worked across ethnic and disciplinary boundaries, what are some of your thoughts on mitigating the power imbalance between researchers in Indigenous communities that Indigenous STS could provide insight in terms of conceptual, methodological, and ethical concerns. So that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant question. Thank you. And are you talking, just to clarify, are you talking about IRBs or ethical review boards that are, mainstream? They're like, Taiwanese hospitals or universities, or are they Indigenous review boards?
They're mainstream, and these are like funding bodies require these procedures. So that's caused, mainstream boards.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, and I want to know why youth amount of Indigenous research has decreased. Maybe I'll ask you why do you think the use of IRBs has decreased the amount of Indigenous research?
Maybe Yo-Yue has better knowledge of this, but there's Indigenous basic law in Taiwan that guarantees collective consent from Indigenous peoples, but the way that the mechanism set up, I'm not saying that there's direct correlation, but since the establishment of IRBs, there has been a decreased number in scientific research involving Indigenous peoples. So of course, it has to do with the political participation and political power of Indigenous peoples in Taiwan, and sort of the raise of that consciousness. But then at the same time, I think for epigenetics, for example, it's very optimistic, and it's something that's, it would benefit Indigenous peoples, would be aligned with their concerns and their needs. So what are some of the methodological or ethical concerns that you might offer for those in Taiwan to sort of conjure up that space between scientific and social sciences and Indigenous communities?
Yeah, so, well, I suppose my first thing was we need a Sing Taiwan, so a summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genomics. So the program that started in the US has been in Canada, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and now in Australia, to really to train up a generation of Indigenous scientists who can lead research. And then that brings up a whole lot of questions about identification of Indigenous people, which were Aina in your thesis partly, which were really, really great insights. But the rise of ethical review alongside Indigenous research guidelines, which I think sounds similar to, was it the common rule? I can't remember the term, but the rule for guiding Indigenous research. I think we've seen the same thing in Australia. I don't have figures on it, and it's always difficult to know, how many people didn't go through with their research. But we do know in Australia, currently, I think it might have changed recently, but through our health research council, if your research is less than 20% concerning Indigenous people, then you don't need to go through the Indigenous pathway for funding. So this is not even ethical review, but just to get funding. So if your research more than 20% involves Indigenous people, you have to go through the Indigenous Review Board for to even achieve funding. So I imagine that is not yet happening in Taiwan, but that means that to even get funding for research with Indigenous people, you need to involve Indigenous researchers, probably have Indigenous researchers as the principal investigator, or you just won't get funded. So is that a good thing? And again, these are really great questions. So I definitely, the projects that get funded tend to be, people who have, close relationships with key Indigenous researchers. And without those relationships, you aren't going to get funded. Are they the very best researchers? Well, in terms of their ability to engage with Indigenous researchers and Indigenous communities, they are. There may be, the most, scientifically competent researchers who might potentially be able to, find the relationship between alcohol use and Taiwanese Indigenous people that might lead to some kind of treatment that will solve the problem. That's a kind of hypothetical, but that research, probably won't happen because it won't get funded or it won't get ethical approval. I think that's probably okay because to be having the skills of engagement, the skills of reflecting the priorities of the community, that is what it means to respect Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous priorities. So we have to accept that there will be a difference between, pure scientific judgment of merit and kind of a broader conception that is appropriate with Indigenous research.
Okay, thank you, Emma. We are 1 minute past the time, but I just want to ask a quick question to have a closure of the session, because we talk about epigenetic about or on Indigenous people. So I'm just wondering, in your context, in the Australian context, how is epigenetic used or seen or accepted by the non-Indigenous group? Just so to complete the whole picture. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I probably I haven't done research on that, but I tend to think, from my general knowledge of the area, I think it is also really popular. So these kind of phrases like "you are what your grandmother ate." So in English we have this phrase "we are what you eat," and then it gets extended to "you are what your grandmother ate," and that's I think that really resonates with people. But I'll just. So, but I'm not sure. I'm sure there is, good STS literature on that. But
I mean, also to a scientific level, that for people who are generally non-Indigenous, they are also looking at it from very scientific view.
Well, actually, interestingly, so all of the research, there's only one actual scientific project that is happening using epigenetics with Indigenous people. So there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of interest, and there have been projects that have not been funded. But one project that has been funded, which is run by a prominent Indigenous researcher, Professor Alex Brown, it's a project about diabetes, and it is using epigenetics, collaborating with an epigenetic researcher. And what that project is actually, it's nothing to do with either developmental. It's not environmental epigenetics per se. It's not about the development of a young child, and it's not about intergenerational trauma. It's just looking at how epigenetics as a mechanism for the development of diabetes complications. So it's looking at Indigenous people with diabetes, and trying to understand what is the mechanism by which some develop complications like heart attacks or kidney problems, and understanding how being exposed to high blood sugar causes changes in the epigenetics, which then lead to things like heart problems and kidney problems. So it's interesting and kind of ironic that when epigenetics is actually used in Indigenous health project, it is not about exposures. It's not about transgenerational trauma at all. So I think that also is another indication of the kind of hype and hope versus the reality.
Okay, thank you very much for Emma, Kowal, and Youyue, and all ask questions and all stay with us through the entire session. So again, Emma, I want to extend our sincere invitation to you that please come to Taiwan and visit us, visit the indigenous land in Taiwan. And this will continue to be a wonderful connections for Taiwan and all the STS researchers here as part of the global STS community.
Thank you so much, Wenling. It's so heartbreaking not to be there in person and experience the wonderful conference that you were planning. Hopefully it will happen and I will come as a participant when it happens.
Yes, thank you. So thank you, everyone. So we have the break until